Next up is Bob Coover and Bobby Arellano and John Cayley about electronic literature.
Yeah, it's time. Oh, would you like a stool, or would you rather just stand there? Yeah, sure.
I think
this one too high.
What about this one here? That's a little too high for me.
Yeah.
Let's try that.
Bingo. How about right there, and I'll bring this chair.
Okay. That's great. This is a 50-year celebration, after all, you know. What do you expect? Okay, ready to go?
Ready.
Once upon a time, in that mythical epoch known as the 60s, 2 or 3 years after the appearance of Julio Cortázar's very influential novel, Hopscotch, I started playing around with edge notch cards, imagining a labyrinthine novel. There they are. Except that had Bobby not had these slides and wanted to use them, we would have skipped this part of the presentation. But anyway, they were punched in such a way that readers could, choosing their own routes, needle out sequences all held together, what I would now call a web work of nonlinear narrative. It was, in effect, a primitive hypertext system, but with its elaborate thesaurus and attendant mechanisms, the coding and punching became numbingly tedious. Moreover, there was no likely publisher for such an eccentric enterprise, so though I continued to use the edge notch cards for note-taking for some years thereafter, I had bought boxes of the damn things and had to use them up somehow, I returned to paper for the fiction writing and the delicious constraints of the page-turning book, which hyperfiction artist and novelist Shelley Jackson has called an odd machine for installing text in the reader's mind, though it too was once an object of wonder. Shelley, perhaps the most innovatively talented of all Brown graduates, has a gift for the aphorism. Hypertext, she has said elsewhere, is a banished body. Its compositional principle is desire. It gives a loudspeaker to the knee, a hearing trumpet to the elbow. Hypertext is the body languorously extending itself to its own limits, hemmed in only by its own lack of extent. What the edge notch system did do was soften me up for the hypertext applications being developed at Brown, from Andy Van Dam's earliest experiments with Hess, the hypertext editing system, and Fress, the file retrieval and editing system, to Brown's creation of the elegant hypertext authoring system, Intermedia. For Hess, Andy had as a principal collaborator Ted Nelson, author of the influential book Computer Lib, Dream Machines, and coiner of the then quasi-magical term hypertext, which soon provided the very grammar of the internet. Nelson, who sees himself as a literary romantic, found in Vladimir Nabokov's classic novel Pale Fire what he has called a real hypertext, and while at Brown actually prepared a stage script of Pale Fire using his and Brown's new hypertext editing system to present on screen to IBM with the hope of getting funding for a very different sort of movie, or at least for an opening light pen link to the industry. IBM never saw it. The presentation was never made, and the script itself disappeared into Brown's files until our leader, Norm Meyerowitz, recently rediscovered the typescript, buried in an unvisited library vault. IBM demo oral script and stage directions. It was George Landau, one of Intermedia's developers, creator of the Victoria Web and author of the landmark book Hypertext, who lured me into teaching my first hyperfiction workshop using Intermedia in 1991. As far as I know, it was another Brown first. Soon there would be open access to the World Wide Web, but at that moment it was closed to commoners like ourselves, and we were still a couple of years away from browsers. So the course was located in room 265 on the second floor of the CIT building, where the intermediate server was uniquely installed. That was where published writers like Andrew Sean Greer, recent winner of the Pulitzer, Will Oldham, Matt Darby, Mary Kim Arnold first played at electronic interactive fiction. I was then strictly a DOS user and had never had a mouse in my hand, except for some white mice I once helped to rescue from my high school after a fire. And I thought a window was something you opened to let the hot air out, not in. So I obtained the services of an undergraduate TA who had learned intermedia in one of George Landau's courses. That was Robert Arellano, also known on the net as Bobby Rabid, who's here with us today, and now a fully bearded, tenured professor in the Oregon wine country. We were both enthusiasts of a new digital medium, Bobby actually producing a graduate student thesis called Altamont that, rechristened Sunshine 69, became the first full-length hypertext fiction on the web. Over the years, while he was still at Brown, as a graduate student and later as an adjunct lecturer, he and I taught what we called hyperfiction workshops, eventually upgraded into electronic writing workshops. And using as our software, with Intermedia suddenly defunct, Eastgate Systems Story Space created by Mark Bernstein. In those days, we did a lot of traveling, spreading the word about Brown's digital literary art workshops across the US, Europe, and Latin America, on campuses, in city libraries, and at literary festivals, including a memorable Christmas time demo in Sweden, where we found Intermedia still running on an old Unix in an art school in Stockholm. Bobby ran at Brown a famous festival of Cuban writing, crossing a line, sending the writers back to Cuba with the software and a lot of new ideas, and we always tried to include a digital component in our Unspeakable Practices series of innovative writing festivals. I was doing a lot of straight-up book reviewing in those days for the New York Times Book Review. So they gave me a bit of space to talk about hypertext in a 1992 piece written immediately after my first workshop, which they called The End of Books. It became a hot ticket in the letters to the editor column, so when I told them I'd like to review all known full-length hyperfictions, while such a task was still possible, something unimaginable in the printed book technology since sometime in the 1450s, and very soon to become, as the World Wide Web became accessible to all via what were called browsers, impossible on the net as well. They generously granted me 7 full pages of the book review, including the illustrated front page. That summer, 1993 piece was called Hyperfiction Novels for the Computer, and included not only an extensive review of Stuart Moulthrup's new Victory Garden, destined to become a hyperfiction classic, along with Michael Joyce's Afternoon and Shelley Jackson's Patchwork Girl, but also a detailed overview of the form and its technology. And hypertext is only the beginning, watch out, plus a review of all the then known full-length hyperfictions. Now then, boot up the reviews. That was also the year that we took the provost and a team from the president's office on what we called a Hyperland tour, a long hike from electronic node to electronic node on campus until we reached the more or less abandoned ground floor of the grad center. And there we laid out our plan for a multi-station work facility for courses in the arts and humanities and for space for what would become the scholarly technology group. The provost wasn't certain that computers were actually here to stay, but the president came up with the funding that created the multimedia lab and adjoining fully equipped classroom. As the millennium began to turn, my friend Jeff Ballou, recently retired as publisher of PC Magazine with all his many tech industry connections, invited me to dinner in London, where we got up the idea of a conference at Brown on the new digital technology, one whose central aim was to bring e-writers and tech developers together for the first time. This became Technology Platforms for 21st Century Literature, TP21CL, largely funded by technology companies, thanks to Jeff, and held at Brown in April of 1999. Among the invitees was Scott Retberg, who was there along with his co-authors to entertain us with readings from their funny, award-winning hyperfiction, The Unknown, and at a lecture in the old Duke Ellington room in the Grad Center, now the Grad Student Lounge, Scott leaned over and asked me if it wasn't time to launch an organization of e-writers. A brief conversation with Jeff Ballou and the Electronic Literature Organization, which has grown to be a vast international organization, was born here on Brown's campus, with Jeff as its first president and Scott its first managing director. When we launched the Hyperfiction Workshop in 1991, a year before the demise of Intermedia, we wanted a space where all class members, indeed any visitors as well, could interact freely. So we opened at the very first workshop, a group fiction writing space called Hypertext Hotel. Here, writers were invited to check in, to open up new rooms, new corridors, new intrigues, to unlink texts or create new links, to intrude upon or subvert the texts of others, to alter plot trajectories, manipulate time and space, to engage in dialogue through invented characters, then kill off one another's characters, or even sabotage the hotel's plumbing. The Hypertext Hotel soon filled with multitudinous guest rooms, bars and restaurants, convention halls and ballrooms, a health club and a swimming pool and a golf course, a library, not to forget the roof and basement where much of the stranger action took place. One of the hotel bars, the Hurricane Lounge, became home to salesmen, musicians, including the Beatles, ladies of the night, frustrated writers, young girls running away from home, randy waitresses, a piratical ghost, and other beings even more out of the ordinary. You can see some of those beings in the room next door at 115. And there's a VR demonstration of the new hotel. A tall tale-telling adventure group held their annual convention in the Grand Ballroom. The writers at the Original Voices Festival of Innovative Women Writers all gathered in the hair salon to have a go at dropping gossipy tales, and sins could be confessed in the chapel, its services conducted by the resident chaplain, Reverend Mark America. Naturally, there were repetitions, too many bartenders, for example, whereupon one writer responded by linking all the bartenders to room 666, which he called the Production Center. An imprisoned alien monster was giving birth to full-grown bartenders on demand. Problem solved, one of them anyway. As you can tell, I've had a lot of fun with the forum, and in particular with the group interactive nature of the hotel and its gift of anonymity. I know that Bobby is happy with the entries he has made to room 212, for example, but I myself have tampered with them, and I assume I am not alone. I must say that working alongside Bobby Arellano has been one of the great pleasures of my life, lived mostly in writerly isolation. I first met him when he came to my office to ask me to supervise his undergraduate thesis. I told him I was paid so little I didn't have to do that. In the course of our conversation, I learned that he had learned Intermedia in a course with George Landau. So I told Bobby I was planning to teach the first Hyperfiction workshop and asked him if he could TA it. Sure, he said, if you'll be my thesis advisor. Bargain struck. Since then, the Hypertext Hotel has enjoyed many iterations, the most recent being the VR version being developed by Bobby and his students at Southern Oregon. And Bobby will explain that to you now.
Thanks, Bob.
So,
Problem solved. Thank you. You know, Scott Repberg's new textbook, which spans nearly a half century of electronic literature, has a final chapter that points to another Brown first, the origins of virtual reality's first literary flickerings on the walls of the cave, connecting us to the Brown graphics group, where in the late 80s, Andy and I think David Laidlaw as well invited artists and writers to come play, to acknowledge the continuing impact of the world's longest continuously running graphics research group, while I also shine a light pen forward on the rapid expansion literary VRscape. I asked my students who came with me from Oregon, Andrew and Quinn, to put together a little process video of how they build literary VR. And I think it might be possible that it could show up on, yeah, oh, as long as I log back in. On that middle screen while I continue with my slides. See how it goes. Thanks, if you managed to. Hey, there it is. Thank you. But first, I actually want to also say thank you to the curators and preservationists and archaeologists and resurrectionists who are here with us. Because without you, this might be all that exists of the Hypertext Hotel. It was only 12 months ago when I learned that about 90% of the more than 500 rooms of the hotel were missing from the only known servers where it had last been seen on the web, lost even to the Wayback Machine. I knew that 54 was just a fraction of the total possible rooms full of stories. The only known backup was finally hacked off of Bob Coover's locked G4 from 2001, which was right here. And in the nerve-wracking interval in which we tried to find whatever might exist from the original 10 years of student and visiting author writing at the hotel, a student brainstorm led to the idea to reboot it, if we ever found it, in virtual reality as well. And so as a result, just a few months ago, this winter, in our pretty little corner of the Pacific Northwest, the lovely Schneider Museum of Art was the place where the Hypertext Hotel VR was born. It's exhilarating watching first-time cybernauts with their headsets and hand controllers check in at the front desk with the voice of Robert Coover in their ear. So far, all we've got is a lobby, manager's office, one guest room, a hallway, and a basement. But my students are schooling me that thanks to Steam and the Unreal Marketplace and the promise of letting a universe full of designers reanimate infinite rooms, it won't be too much trouble to watch the hotel grow. Most amazing of all is that when recently it would have taken 5 figures, sun stations, and a room full of equipment to simulate, is now possible with material you can get off the rack at Best Buy and visible and experience in art museums, and also possible to create on a laptop using Blender, Substance, and Unreal Engine 4 by emerging artists like Andrew and Quinn. If you haven't already, please pop your head in next door to room 115, try on the headset at reception, and let Coover check you into the Hypertext Hotel VR. Before I let John Cayley tell you about Brown's recent essential development in digital language arts, I'd like to give you just a brief walkthrough of what you will see in 3D if you manage to get the Hypertext VR headset on. And oh, that's right, I have to play it off this one.
Front desk. Welcome to the Hypertext Hotel. all newly elected members of the board of directors may read, write, and sleep over here, moving in wherever they feel most comfortable, the whole hotel at their disposal. Guests, too, may range freely. This is not so much a friendly hotel as it is one without proper management.
So pop into the Hypertext Hotel. You can check in anytime you like, and you can always leave. And finally, just what a wonderful week it's been. Thanks so much, Norm, Andy, and all the folks who've been organizing this, because it got me in touch with some old friends and classmates like Tom Meyer and, let me think, Daniel Shine and Dan Robbins, who up there in the Pacific Northwest with me recently said he'd like to send a brief appreciation for those days that he was kind of the graphics group's Hemdall, guardian of Asgard, and let me and Bob Coover come in and play around with Tom and Benjamin Shine and himself, coding in UGA, if I remember correctly. And they helped us adapt Bob's flash fiction into a standalone VR story called Inside the Frame Interactive. Dan sent me this short tribute last night. I have to read it. I didn't even have time to add it to my slides. And to me, this, better than anything, shows how much Brown, Andy, and Bob, for me, are enmeshed in both the past and future perfect of hypertext at Brown. Picture a cutting-edge research lab with a fervent combination of distracted undergrads, sleep-deprived grad students, and a hodgepodge collection of workstations, custom equipments, snaking cables, and nearly empty pizza boxes. Some are working on school assignments, some are dreaming of a new startup, and many are contributing to groundbreaking fundamental research in computer science. Energy often attracts energy, and in comes one day a classically trained scholar who has carved out a new field of literature, recomposed across the expanse of hypertext. With him are a few curious and devoted students. They come bringing sentences, not bytes, stories, not code, but they seek collaboration, tools, and ultimately a new way of expressing and sharing creativity. For there is confusion as words that sound alike mean different things to different disciplines, but soon enough commonalities are discovered and gears are joined together. Each group learns from the other and each gives some of what they didn't know was precious. Thanks, Bob, and thank you, Andy. John Cayley.
I apologize, this is language. Is the mic's on now? Okay. And I decided to title this piece, Alexa, what is hypertext? By the time I arrived to work full-time at Brown in 2007, hypertext had long since taken over what Ted Nelson recognized as the docuverse of words on networked screens, although literature was and is still everywhere in books and print. By then, the technical affordances of linked lexia and pages were so familiar as to have become transparent, invisible, internalized for everyone who used, as opposed to read, the web. And this everyone meant, even then, almost everyone in the developed world. But there was little awareness that hypertext as such was a reconfigured form or formally instituted subculture of reading. That it could become a new form, commensurate with the novel, as Bob famously proposed, for literary art. Students reading from the web are, even today, unclear about whether or not they are reading hypertext, or what it might mean to say that this is what they are doing. They just read pages, web pages. It was, in practice, easier to get ambitious young poets to make granular, mildly dynamic, hypertextual lyrics for on-screen display than to convince aspiring creative writing program novelists to consider hypertext for their literary debut. It was the actual practice of writing, more fundamentally, that had been steadily changing and evolving from, I would say, the advent of the word processor, and then in the mid-90s, the rollout of the web. It is a matter of what goes into the lexia and the linked pages, and also now where, in cultural and physical space, the lexia themselves are located. The extreme temporal ends of the continuum that I am imagining from the late 1970s up until today look like this. Back then, the human writer, physical library at hand, typed. The word processor was just a typewriter. Gobbets of human language and launched them one way or another into the typographic literary world. Today, with networked access to cut and paste intertextuality, the would-be writer competes and collaborates with neural net enhanced natural language processing to fill out multimodal, repurposable lexia, including those of the literary world. And these lexia may present themselves in mixed realities, where high art, including literary art, entertainment, games, and gamified institutional and cultural life are difficult to distinguish. At Brown, since 2007, this meant that I was able eventually to welcome 2 per annum electronic writers to the MFA program in literary arts. I have engaged with these graduate fellows to fill lexia by many means and in all manners, always hoping that a couple of these writers would be as interested as I was and am in the aesthetic application of self-authored coding, of computation that is compositionally implicated for the work, in terms, for example, of text generation or algorithmic modulation. And on the spatial citing of lexia front, I took over from Bob a writing course in the so-called cave, an immersive artificial stereo 3D graphics multimedia environment, practicing in new media that were also pioneered by Brown CS under Andy Van Dam and David Laidlaw's guidance. Thus, the lexia as typography are still trying to find their way into our everyday perceptual world of increasingly mixed reality. Some writers at Brown will be ready when this happens, but I don't think that it will happen until human perceptual space can be shared with hardware affordances rather than being taken over and dominated by such devices. I do mean by this that head-mounted VR is a deadening end, and that to have any cultural momentum, shared meat space immersive VR would have to compete with the entertainment infrastructure of cinema or television. And this is not happening yet. Roll on ultimate mixed reality theater. That's an inside joke, by the way, for yurt goers. Language is the stuff that fills or should fill whatever lexia are presented to us for reading. And it is language that should do so wherever, spatially, these presentations are made manifest. Language is still the medium of writers, as its languages, most famous, familiar, and fondly treasured artists. Now, as I say, younger readers and writers, most humans in fact, are exposed to or are collaborating with the virtual linguistic productions of natural language processing, often neural network enhanced, more than I ever will. They are, because of this, making language differently. There are major concerns with respect to these circumstances, for which some, in our current context, including at Brown, will or should have institutional pastoral care. Is language, let alone mind, computable? Human reading understanding is constitutive of all and especially literary language. Even if the production of virtual language is computable, does this mean that the same goes for human reading understanding? I say that language is not computable for either production or reception. And I also say that, regardless of any computability of language as such, all the virtual, artificial language that has been or is being computed so far is made from the transcription of graphilex rather than from language in anything like its totality and fullness. By that I mean simply that contemporary computations uses text, and text is at best a transcription of what Walter Ong calls a graphylect, which is written language, not all language. But if you insist that language is computable, then there remains, just down the road from us in MIT, Charles R. Gallistell's problem. He works with Chomsky. Some of you must know him. Quote, bioenergetic calculations show that if human brains were to achieve, quote, the required data processing power for the type of computational processes that could handle, quote, hierarchical structure processing in language, i.e. some version of an operational, broadly Chomskyan computational grammar, quote, as a kind of recurrent neural network, this is all quoting from Chomsky and Burrick, such speculative post-human brains would boil their own blood. This also brings up for me the more general question concerning a climate change sensitive ethics with respect to the heat and waste of neural net computation in general, or as a probabilistic substitute for hierarchical structure processing in language. Yeah, I know, I've got to get to the end of this. It's like a piece, but I'm almost there. And the less clearly related proof of work wastefulness of contemporary blockchain ledgers for everything, apparently even philosophical and political language. All this without yet mentioning what I believe is the most significant development in computational culture for years, and the one most likely to have a profound effect on the cultural situation of language and its arts, namely, the advent of humanoid transactive synthetic language in the form of robust automatic speech recognition, analysis, and synthesis. Because language is a species-unique, evolved faculty and will obey evolutionary temporal scales with respect to changes in its characteristics, and because humans evolved to have language in orality, transactive synthetic language could, in principle, give language in orality all the cultural affordances of literature and in a manner that resonates with our language faculty's genetic predisposition. I think that's a big one, by the way. Some time ago, I renamed the track in literary arts that I direct and called it Digital Language Arts. Shakespeare is still the epitome of literary art in English, whereas he is at the fountainhead of English theatre's centuries of aesthetic practice. In the future, I believe, apart from mixed reality, gamified cultural forms, scripted by thousands of relatively conventional writers, we will have and enjoy not just literature, but a hypertextual orature. Thank you.
I wanted to take this time to thank Elli, who heads the digital scholarly technology, there's so many names that are similar, scholarly technology group in the library, and who helped me find stuff, and then Karen Eberhardt, who is the archivist who dug in boxes of Andy's old mislabeled videotapes to help me find the Hess video. So I'm very grateful for all of their help. And now we have Elli Mylonas and Alan Renear.
All right. So I guess the theme here is the sweeping effects of FRES in the Brown hypertext community, which for me everything I've done really comes from a few small sparks of Fress and this community. So I arrived at Brown University in 1976 as a philosophy graduate student. Olivia Newton-John was having a hit with Please, Mr. Please. So not a good year for rock and roll. I arrived with my Hermes typewriter, and I set it up, and beside my typewriter, I put that unbended paper clip, which some of you may think you use to reboot the typewriter. No, it's to dig the crap out of the E on the striker. I was prepared for lots of things. The Brown Philosophy Department was world-renowned, and it was highly technical, very sophisticated, competitive. You took a deep breath when you arrived. I was not prepared to be told that the faculty member I had come to work with, renowned philosopher, one of the most renowned philosophers of the late 20th century, at least among philosophers, renowned among philosophers, actually used the computer to write his papers. I could not even understand what that meant. How do you use a computer to write your papers? That, of course, was Roderick Chisholm, and he was using Fress. He'd show up in the seminar with fan-fold rainbow paper, fixed pitch type, mixed case, which they put on twice a day, I think. And I wanted to be like him, so I learned Fress. And I was astounded at how Fress was implemented in the philosophy department. Josiah Strandberg had created macros and scripts and things that made it look like Fress understood what we did. There were macros for axioms and definitions and parts of definitions and theorems, automatic appendix that put all those things into an appendix if you used them in the paper. It was pretty stunning, and I was pretty fascinated by this. At the same time, it was easy to see that Fress was not the right place to be at that time. There was a daunting message from Andy, I think, saying this is not supported, use it at your own risk. This was line at a time, no points addressable, VT100 access. So I used Waterloo script and I created my own macros. Many of them look like the ones that have been developed for the department. But I became fascinated by just the structure of text and the structure of analytic philosophy. One day, as I remember it, the message changed. We had seen that daunting message for a couple of years. Suddenly it was different. It was, no, this time it's real. So brace yourself a bit. This has been a great day talking about the development of Hess and Fress and everything it did. Now comes a little poignant moment. Fress was not going to run on the next version of VM. It was over. We had to get off. And I became the new Josiah Strandberg. My job was to get my advisor by that time into a new system, Waterloo script. To do that, I had to develop new macros and teach him how to use this. Once again, all of my philosophy work slowed down because trying to understand how a hypertext system with view specs and links and so on could be implemented in VM, so we'd have the same functionality, and could reflect the methods of analytic philosophy was every bit as enchanting for me, almost as enchanting anyway, as analytic philosophy. So I worked hard at this. I began spending most of my days programming. It's an old story for graduate students, I guess. I should have been doing other things. Totally enchanted by the possibilities. I read everything I could from Engelbart to Van Dam. And when the time came to move on, I decided I didn't want to be correcting Venn diagrams in a state I couldn't find on the map. I'd rather stay here and be part of this great community. And fortunately, Steve Carmody actually gave me my first grown-up job with health insurance. So the next 20 years, many, many things happened. Let's, the slide, or make it the slides.
I got the slides. I just put your first reveal up.
Tons of things happened, and you could summarize them this way. We were building the tunnels under Disneyland. That was what I think characterized a lot of what I was doing anyway. We wanted to we wanted to organize data, especially textual data, so that it could support all of the high functionality, the views, the links, the processable objects, and so on and so forth, that we all wanted, but we felt we couldn't do this unless we found a way to organize so-called semi-structured data, text, in ways that would actually support these things. So as a consequence, we focused on developing abstractions, in fact, abstractions on steroids, some of our colleagues thought, that would allow us to represent textual structure that would deliver in a sustainable, reliable way going forward, high performance hypertext. And Alan Kay said using a computer should be like flying a jet plane through information space. We thought so too, and we didn't think it could happen without mixing our metaphors, the tunnels. So 20 years is a long time. This is my little slice of the 50. This is just a handful of acronyms about what we were working on. Elli's going to talk to you. Elli's still here, yep. About some of these things in detail.
Okay. No, I gotta go back. All right. So I'm going to talk to you about a parallel stream, a motley crew of people who would show up and try to be part of things while many of the events that you've heard were going on. And so something missing on that slide. No, oh well. I think there's something missing on my slide, but I'm not going to worry about it. So in the mid-'80s, a motley group began to form. We were very informal, and there were a variety of activities that were set into motion. They took place in departmental seminar rooms, in the graduate center bar, and conference rooms that we could kind of sneak into, perhaps, and consisted of Alan, who was a graduate student in philosophy on hiatus, David Durand, recent CS grad, Steve DeRose, CS grad, linguistics graduate student, me, classics graduate student, and user of mainframe word processing. And we were the core around which religious studies graduate students, faculty in Slavic and German studies, CIS staff, the occasional hanger-on, some visitors from Boston, they all began to coalesce. We were all interested in learning about technologies such as hypertext, structured or semi-structured text. As we were coming from the humanities, mostly, we were familiar with the problems of scholars as they engaged with variant texts, with complex texts, with texts in weird languages, and character sets, problems of citation, and of course, the importance of longevity, sharing, and reuse, which some of you may know as the FAIR principles today. So sometime in 1984, maybe a little bit earlier, we don't have documents much earlier than that, the Computers in the Humanities Users Group, so the name gives you the date, right, was formed. We were informal, we were opportunistic, we were persistent. Initially, we met every 2 weeks in those seminar rooms and in the bar, and we took turns presenting new topics, or we invited local experts. We presented to one another, and we looked at faculty with potential digital computing applications. We didn't say digital in those days. and learned from one another. We engaged upon topics like OCR, that Kurzweil was kind of beginning to make its way. And we may even have looked at the internals of RTF to understand how it worked. And we certainly discussed a lot about non-Roman character sets. Chugg became more active. The piece of the slide that seems to be missing says 500 speakers, 30 years. Alan wrote that part. I think it's more like 25 years and 250 speakers, maybe 400 meetings, but he exaggerates all the time. So
It's closer to 500 than 250.
he took it out. Anyway, so we met every 2 weeks. Later we met a little less frequently. And as our networks and our connections grew, our friends and colleagues who would be passing through Boston or nearby cities, we would ask them to come and give a talk. We would, the recompense was usually a dinner and a place to stay. And if the person was really important, we might wangle some money from computer CIS or a department. And we had a ton of amazing people. These are people from Brown, from all over the world, who were involved in digital humanities computing, and so on. And that's just a selection that I pulled out of our listserv with the announcements. I think I put my mic on the wrong place. So we tapered off around the 2000s, but Chugg essentially kept going at least till after 2010 in a diminished way. So that was a kind of a community, formation of a community that was informal, was happening around here, and which was very aware of many of the things that you've heard about already today. I mean, they were influencing us, we knew about them, we were inspired by them. So one of the technologies and methodological approaches that drove Chugg and the group that came out of it, a group that was formed later, was an interest in developing and applying markup to humanistic texts. So it might also have driven some people away. We did go on and on about it, but it certainly drove us. Alan, as Alan pointed out, he was influenced by Fress, and Steve and David had learned about word processing from Fress. They didn't think you could do it in any other way. And I was a classics grad student, and I had an advisor who basically said, you must learn to word process on the mainframe because I want to have any revisions I want. I want you to make any revisions I want, and I don't want to feel guilty. Because I wouldn't have to type them, right? So I went to a workshop at the computer center, and Alan was teaching it. So that was kind of the beginning of the end for me. I'm not a classics professor, as you can tell.
Yeah, thanks.
We wrote script macros, and so he taught me what to do script, and of course he said, you don't really want to give commands to a formatter. This is really what you want to do. So we started writing script macros, and we started thinking about discipline-specific macros, as Alan was describing about philosophy, quotations, poetic lines, textual fragments. And eventually Waterloo GML came on the scene, a more powerful macro language. We jumped onto that bandwagon, tried to teach it to everybody, told all the faculty we were, at that point I was teaching workshops too, that that's what they had to learn. And eventually, Alan, David, and Steve introduced SGML to the group, a complicated and verbose way to enrich a text. It had little available rendering software, but was so amazingly full of promise for text analysis, text formatting, and generalizable. So I often show an early volume of Computers in the Humanities when I give an XML or XML talk now, where they would have a list of available corpora. And it would give you, by the way, it was never the Catano article issue, because that was always stolen. It's very popular. Well, now it's online, but it described which texts you could get and how they were marked up for computer use. One guy used $signs, another person had lowercase, somebody didn't have lowercase, so on and so forth. It was chaos. So when that was the state of the art. And I show that to show where we were coming from and why something like SGML was so appealing. In 1987, we learned about a group of people who'd gotten together who ended up forming what became the Text Encoding Initiative. Does anybody know about the Text Encoding Initiative?
Explain.
Oh, going to. I just was wondering if I was speaking to the choir here. So the Text Encoding Initiative was an effort that began at that time to make humanities computing easier by creating what was then a DTD for SGML that would be applicable to encoding humanistic, historical literary texts. And the influence of the TI, it started out as a way to just make humanities computing easier and better. But the influence of the TI and the people involved in it ended up becoming, it leaked into XML and XLink, and the people involved in it, including many of us here at Brown, became involved in the development of the XML standard. So in a way, I'll talk a little bit more in a second. Am I okay for time? No, we have 20 minutes total. And then they have 20 minutes. So, okay, I'm going to wrap up real fast then. So, so a lot of what happened in this group ended up becoming very important for the formation of XML, the way we understand hypertext today for many people. I'm going to move on quickly. A number of very important publications came out of this group. Thank you. There are more lines on that thing. It's got that striptease reveal.
Yeah, take a little more time now.
I'll just go.
No.
So basically, a number of important publications came out of this group as well that were very important. Well, the most significant was Coombs, Renear, and DeRose, which was published in CACM in '87 and is cited a lot when people write about markup and the humanities. And then Durand and DeRose wrote a book on high time. This is before XML, of course. And finally, an article that has been misquoted and quoted for years, What is Text Really?, in which DeRose, Durand, Mylonas, and Renear, I forget the order, keep going, there's more there, essentially define and state that a text is best represented as an ordered hierarchy of content objects, ergo OCO up on the screen, because that is what text really is. So we sort of reneged on that in a later article, but this one gets... So, and a sideline, in '87 or '88, I took a lot of the chug knowledge, the hypertext knowledge, and the markup knowledge with me to Harvard, where I went to work on the Perseus project, which was a big classical hypertext project that actually is still around because it was marked up in SGML, and it's now on the web. So I'll move on very quickly, and I'll say the last development I want to talk about is the formation of the Scholarly Technology Group in 1994, which was a sort of an unsanctioned outgrowth of CIS. Alan managed to persuade the VP for computing to let him form a cost recovery group of 3 people. We were essentially 1 FTE, 3 people, to work on humanities computing with the Brown faculty. And one of the things that was interesting, I'm going very fast now, but I just want to say that many of the people we worked with and who came to us, because we brought in Fress at the beginning, I'm going to bring in Intermedia now, they knew Intermedia. It was a Brown project. They were familiar with Intermedia, and they wanted to do something like that. And of course, we inherited the people, and we also inherited the furniture from Iris, which had just closed, because we were in a basement, and they kindly gave us this furniture. So, we did some very early web projects. We worked on text projects. The Women Writers Project, which is a now 30-year-old XML corpus of writing by women from early printing to about 1820, were started here. And finally, I should say that STG was also involved in using its markup expertise in standards organizations, as I mentioned before. David and Steve were part of the XML, W3C XML committee, and STG was a very big participant in the development of Open eBook, which is what you now know as EPUB. And we built a Open eBook publishing framework compiler thing that we had online here for many years. And one common element of many of our projects was that they had a structured text component. Texts were encoded in TI using the TI schema, and we always tried to make sure that the tunnels under Disney World were robust and well architected. That way you could get new rides really easily. So the last thing I'll say is STG was traded to the library in the early 2000s. They took media services and IT and they gave us to the library, like baseball players. And many of the early STG staff had left, and like many of the people we've heard about here today, went off into the world and had lots and lots of influences and effects based on what they brought with them from Brown. But currently there's the Center for Digital Scholarship in the Brown University Library, which I lead, probably because I'm the only one left of the old group. But we're still doing things that look a lot like what we used to do, and we're driven by many of the same sort of values and technological approaches. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say. And
I'm going to add an ornamental end here, maybe. I don't think that any of these things, and there are many more we could have put up, would have happened without FRES and the hypertext community, even though few of them are hypertext related, few of these anyway.
they're ish.
Ish. Right, but they're as much about there's as much more about enabling, I think. But none of, certainly my participation and most of these things, I think, just would not have happened without that community. And for me, there was kind of a phoenix moment when I learned that it was basically up to me to convert the FRES files that existed and various faculty members were using into another format. David Durand wrote me an output API for FRES, and then gave me 45-second instruction on programming. It was my entire, a minute and a half. Yeah, he gave me a minute and a half instruction on programming, and at that, and I went about taking the last working FRES files on campus and converting them into script files, but trying to reflect all of the intellectual work that went into the enhancements that so many people like Josiah had made. It was kind of a poignant moment, at least in retrospect, but it happened, and I think was the seed that made the rest of the 20 years what they were.
I'll share the mic. It's right there. Okay. I guess what Andy is saying is, as you know, the Computer History Museum is taping this, has been doing oral histories, and has materials and is collecting materials about these projects, these pieces of software, and these developments in the history of computing. But I also, and he'll tell you about that, but I also wanted to point out that the Brown University Library and the archives already have an intermedia archive that Paul Kahn deposited with them when IRIS closed its doors. And we also have some of computer science's tapes and some of the graphics materials. And we are really eager, and the archivist, when she found out about this event, is really eager to be a place where certain types of materials are stored. We have a repository, a digital repository. I don't know how many of you tweet. I don't get the impression this is a tweet-ish crowd, but I've already tweeted the URL for the Hess tape that you saw. It was put on the BDR yesterday. And we'd love to work with love to be able to collect the appropriate materials for our archives and work together with you, who would be collecting appropriate materials for your archives.
Thank you. So I'm Mark Weber, Curatorial Director of the Internet History Program at the Computer History Museum. And when I asked Andy and Norm to show whatever they could at the Engelbart Symposium in December, I never dreamed it would turn into this feast. This is essentially a resurrectionist dream made real in terms of preservation and live demos of some of the key software that made our online world. The Internet History Program tells the story of our online and mobile worlds and their role in people's lives, builds on the extensive networking materials and exhibits at CHM, and on the web history work of myself and colleagues going back to 1995. The Software History Center, headed by my colleague David Brock, who was here earlier, chronicles the evolution of software and is at the cutting edge for questions of how to preserve, interpret, and access that intangible medium. So we collect historic software, documents, objects, videos, and more. And to offer or suggest things, please get in touch, either under the Collections tab on our site, or I'm Weber, W-E-B-R, at computerhistory.org. And thank you for putting this wonderful thing together.
Well, Mark and David did a lot of interviews, oral histories yesterday and today, and they'll do some tomorrow, so even more information will get captured. And also, Elli didn't say this, but all the SGML work that she and others did is referenced in the sixth message that Tim Berners-Lee wrote when the web first began. So we were noticed. Now we have Dave Sklar and Steve DeRose to talk about an outgrowth of that work that became a commercial.
Very good. Hi there. Yeah, this is going to be very different because, to my knowledge, this is the only entity being discussed today that started from the ground up, from day one, as a for-profit company about building a product and printing money. That's what this was all about. And I know that Intermedia did, of course, sell their product, right? And we've talked about that earlier today, but to my knowledge, you would never call Irish a for-profit institution. Is that about right? So this is quite a different entity. And this all started with Lou Reynolds, and he had, so he had worked with Cadre Technologies, and I believe we have the founder of Cadre Technologies right here with Lou Maz. And Lou was, I believe, a VP of marketing or sales or something like that. And he had seen an entire industry rise up out of a DoD standard. He knew that that was a very common thing that happens because the DoD or the government is creating a need kind of in an artificial way, and it suddenly drives a lot of innovation. And he saw military standard 2361, all of us remember that, right? Show up. And basically it was mandating the way that the government would be receiving information from the contractors that built very complex, huge weapon systems, submarines, et cetera. And SGML was one of those standards. That was very intriguing. SGML was going to be mandated. So he saw coming out of this a whole new industry, an e-book industry. And so he wanted to get involved and learn about this. Now, he looked around to take a look at what are the basically print-to-screen, in other words, e-book type technologies that were already available for sale, right? And I asked Steve whether this is really the complete list. And for the most part, that was the complete list, if you can imagine. That was the set of e-book products that were out. We had Owl Guide, which was mentioned earlier today. And then we have, of course, Intermedia, which was, of course, being sold as a product. All of these use proprietary markup, however. And if they had structure, it may have been implied by the headings or stuff like that, right? It wasn't really what was that acronym I just learned about from Elli? OCHO, right? It wasn't really an
OCO.
OCO. It wasn't really an OCO. So he also took a look at the UXs of these tools, and it wasn't what was going to be needed for truly large-scale, structured, interactive electronic technical manuals. So he approaches Lou. He was originally going to go to Silicon Valley, but then he realized, wow, Brown's right in my backyard, and they've been doing so much in this area. So he approaches Lou. Lou says, he approaches Andy, and Andy says, you want money from me? And he said, no, I just want some talent. I want some recommendations. And Andy delivers him to Steve right here, and Jeff Vogel, who is right there. Now, Jeff Vogel was an undergraduate. I believe you were about to apply to law school, or had you already gotten in? You'd already gotten into Columbia Law, I believe. And Lou, of course, shook him by the shoulders and shook the law school out of him. Right? So you can't, because he was this fantastic software guy, right? Also, I think Andy was very instrumental in getting us a lot of hardware that was like gently used. Brown was going to be selling these gently used used hardware, and I think Andy did a lot of that too, right? Yeah. And of course, Greg Lloyd was one of the people who was also brought in for those very early meetings, right? Now, so he's looked around and he's realized there's no products that are really doing this yet. So of course he wants to build one from scratch. On the way, as he's going to trade shows, he runs into something called Bellcore Superbook. This wasn't really productized yet, but it was kind of on its way. Bellcore was trying to figure out what to do with this thing, and he liked what he saw in terms of the UX. It was exactly the UX that made sense for very large IETMs. And you can see the breadcrumb that's showing arbitrary amount of hierarchy on the right. And on the left, it had this really nifty feature of showing search hit counts at each section level. Thought that was very innovative. Now, this was initially just a UX kind of inspiration. It wasn't going to have anything to do with electronic book technologies. But what happened next was this is where I get you into some startup drama. The V1 business plan did not attract funding. So all of a sudden, this is a startup that, whoa, what do we do next? Do you give up? Do you bootstrap? Or do you try to do some piggyback on a large entity? This is the kind of thing that startups have to deal with a lot in the early days. And here was a possibility. Why don't we partner with Bellcore? We would build a new system from scratch. It wouldn't be using Bellcore code. That was all in Lisp, right? And it didn't have a great renderer, and it was really slow, right? But you would be able to borrow UX ideas without fear of litigation from Bellcore. You'd be able to use the cool name SmartBook, great name, right? Superbook, Superbook. And then you would also get this marketing muscle, because the Bellcore was the Bell Labs for all the baby bells after the AT&T split up, right? So imagine having that whole marketing team behind you. So that was something that was considered. Well, those talks fell through. It was not consummated. So bootstrapping is what Steve and Jeff did. They finished a working demo by the middle of 1990. You had your first big demo with Computer Sciences Corporation. It was held in Newark Airport because they were too embarrassed to invite them to their little Richmond Square offices. So they just did it in the airport. And it was time, this is bootstrapping. So every cell helps you put another set of labor hours into the product. That bootstrapping worked, though, because attention was gained and excitement was achieved, and the checks started coming in. So this is just an overview of the Dynatext architecture. It would receive SGML of any tag set. And that was really innovative, because even though there were already SGML authoring and editing systems, and some of them even printed to paper, they would take only a specific DTD. I guess it was the CAL's DTD.
Actually, the authoring systems would take arbitrary schemas, but none of the delivery systems.
And they were delivering only to paper, and the delivery systems would only take CAL's DTD.
And the desktop publishing, like Interleaf and Frame, only took CAL's, right, Jeff?
Right.
Oh, sorry.
Right.
Yeah,
the arbitrary DTD was only
clear.
kind of...
There were a couple of general SGML authoring systems, like SoftQuad.
Right.
Yeah.
So this was very distinctive, to have a delivery system, though, that took in an arbitrary tag set. That was very unique at the time. It would run through the Dynatext compiler, and the revenue model was based on a fee per crank of that wheel, right? And then it would produce your ebook as a hierarchical file system. You could put that on CD-ROM, or you could put that on the hard disk if you were delivering like a workstation documentation. And one really cool thing about it was that every view of that book was done through a style sheet. Even the TOC was a filtered view of the book, showing only the headings, right? And you could have any number of style sheets, large print style sheets, etc., list of figures, all of that could be done through the style sheets. And then there was the interactive reader. Free reader model was one of the models that it was a free reader, and in some of the other lower cost models there would be a per seat charge for the reader. All right, so that gives you a little bit of feel for the revenue model and for the architecture. Now, Steve is about to do a demo, so I'm not showing any Dynatext screenshots because you're about to get the real thing. One of the cool things that he will talk about, though, is the dynamic flow rendering that could reflow the text from any starting point. And that's not something that even web browsers do today. If you change the width of your web browser, it is reflowing from the top. Also, he will introduce the very powerful full-text structured indexing, had proximity, wildcards, etc. One key element of making this possible for IETMs, making this useful to these large technical manuals, was the scalability. It did not load the entire book into memory. It grabbed sections from the disk as needed. So that scalability was, of course, essential for these enormous manuals. All right, so I was brought on board to build a style sheet editor. I'll just show a picture of that, but we had a WYSIWYG style sheet editor. That now shows up in HTML, CSS IDEs, but it came very late on the scene, actually.
Yep.
And we went to Mac and Windows in 1993, and I was then put on, we had to build a bigger audience on the publishing side, and SGML was just not something that everybody dealt with. There were a lot of industries that were not mandated to use SGML, so we brought in, I headed the team that did Dynatag, so that we could take your documents from word processors as well and convert them to SGML. But one interesting thing that Lou, I had a conversation with Lou last night, and he apologizes for not having been here because he said he was going to be here, but he told me that Tim Byrne received an evaluation Dynatext in 1990. He was excited by it because he didn't have a renderer at that time. So in early 1991, when Lou was visiting, Switzerland, they got together. Lou got a demo of the protocol that he was building, the protocol stack that he was building on a Next machine to just show remote access to materials. And he asked for a free, lightweight Dynatext. Could you put it in a form that would be free of charge? Well, our revenue model, our entry point was like at $1 million, right? Our revenue model was just not going to support this. There were talks with Steve and Jeff and Lou to try to see if we could come up with an NRAM lightweight Dynatext browser. But there were just so many other things to get done with this new startup, that was now like 2 years into its life cycle. So that just fell by the wayside, and nothing ever happened with that. All right. It was sold to Inso in 1996, and that's kind of, if you want to know more about the sort of end game story, you can come up and talk to me afterwards. Right? This was a style sheet editor, the first thing that I did. Hierarchical style sheet editor, had concepts of inheritance, everything you would expect, kind of very CSS-like, but you had this WYSIWYG display in the lower left corner, and that was very innovative for that time. Dynatag allowed you to enter this publishing space without having to know SGML. You would use an interactive system to create a conversion model for your specific style sheet. Hopefully you're using style sheets in a very consistent manner. And then once you create that model, you could just push word processing documents through that engine, and it would generate your binary ebook, a picture of the Dynatag user interface. So now you're going to see the real thing. This is the Dynatag reader, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Okay, I'm still on, I guess. All right. Unfortunately, I was not able to find any books in the final release of Dynatext, so this is one release back from that. Jeff is probably the only person in the room who knew that. So it actually got better than this later on. If you glanced at this when I first started it up, it had up a copy of The Wife of Bath's Tale from the Canterbury Tales. A fellow by the name of Peter Robinson put together an edition. This was packaged with the CD and everything, little manual with it, all that good stuff. Which was a variorum edition, which the humanists in the room will know is a collation of all the varying manuscripts. Of course, before Gutenberg, right, every manuscript is going to be slightly different. And scholars want to know, well, is this line always phrased this way, or is it spelled or phrased completely differently in another manuscript? And which manuscript was early, all this sort of thing. All of them are in here, and you can view the collations, view them in various sorts of organizations. So anyways, I skipped away from that since most of us probably aren't familiar with that dialect, to what was just our reader guide. Here it is. You see the expandable table of contents over here. This is actually running off a Mac Mini from 15 or 20 years ago and off a CD-ROM drive. So it's not the fastest in the world. Did have graphics. This, I think, was some data that Iris gave us, actually, to play with. Is that right, Paul? Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I clicked the Okay. You could, however, as David mentioned, have views with different style sheets. So if we want a view with all the graphics in line, we can just do that instead. And again, this is all being built off SGML structures underneath. And very importantly for this publishing model, that information is all kept inside. None of the SGML syntax, there's not a pointy bracket in there, but the structure that it entails was all kept isomorphically inside, which meant you could just generate the pointy bracketed stuff back out. And actually, the same fellow who did this did an edition of the archives of the British Parliament, called me up about 15 years later and said, Parliament lost the SGML file, but they still have a CD-ROM of the Dynatext book. Can you help us? So I wrote him a little tiny script that just exported it all back out, which strained my memory a bit for where the bits were, but it worked. Also integrated with the system was a search engine. I will do very little to show this, but let's search for the word window. And we quickly accumulate the number of hits. You can see there we have 193 hits for that word in this entire book. Not surprising given what the book is. And they break down in this way throughout the structure. So there's a couple of them. Now, if I asked for window inside paragraph, we had various other UIs for searching later, but this was just the raw one that you got by default. That will, in fact, get us most of the same ones. It will exclude ones that are in headers or other things like that. But you could also do something like this, which is slightly different. Now that should provide you the same, well, not necessarily the same number of hits, but notice that what's selected for the hit here is the entire paragraph and not the thing, because that's what you asked for. There was a lot more. You could do direct and indirect containment, things near each other, ordered initial and final and central wildcards, all sorts of good stuff like that. But I'm not going to go into that. Auto-numbering things. I think the main innovations, though, are things that we took pretty much straight from Fress, so they're not really innovations, which was you could have arbitrary stuff about the document, like keywords, controlling visibility and formatting, very much like view specs. You had outline views, you had structure, all kinds of different views. And you had this dynamic formatting, a little prettier than Fress, but pretty much the same idea there. Let's see, anything else? Oh, one last thing I wanted to say about the demo. You may have seen me resize the window before and everything rewrapped, which it would do. One of the nicest things about this, and one of the things that got us several patents, is that we could do that on an arbitrarily large document. So Boeing puts a 747 manual in, which I'm told cannot be carried in print on a 747 cargo plane. If you think about the number of subsystems that have to be fully documented, right? Every little piece of avionics. But we could jump in at the end of that and instantly rewrap to your current window size. Try that with a big document on the web now. Scroll to the bottom, resize your window, and go for coffee. So we had a few really nice things there. If you want to see the packaging, this was our packaging. $35 for the box, which people didn't mind because SGI, Sun, DEC, Nobel, Boeing, Ryder, all these folks, they were paying us, in 7 figures for a site-wide license or for delivering the silicon graphics. How many people ever used an SGI box with Iris Insight on it for the documentation? A few people? Yeah, a few. Okay, that was their online doc, and that was an OEM version of ours. We had a customer come in, or a friend of, it was one of your friends that came in and said, I've got my SGI box, and it's got much nicer delivery software than your stuff. It's like, so I think I'm done. Who's up next? I
think next is the tag and dash folks.
As you mentioned, this is also a resurrection story. There was a ton of scrambling by the EBT folks to find the various bits, both for the code and for the documentation, and they managed, following David's and Norm's wonderful examples. So this entire day could also be called Resurrection Day.
Yeah.
Waiting to set up the next one, I should mention. Johns Hopkins published my book in Dynatext. They did it in two forms. Use it either as it just looked like an HTML outputted version of the printed book, or it could look like a hypertext. And they did a very, very good job arranging it with their help.
Neat. All these wonderful stories. Okay, we ready? Let's have the slide, and then I can talk to it. Yeah. Okay, so a little bit of history. You've heard that the Scholarly Technology Group got moved to the library. One of the many reasons for that is that we had a very visionary university librarian named Harriet Hamasi, who unfortunately is no longer with us. She moved to Georgetown. In any case, she called me up one day, and from somewhere she had learned that my group had moved from virtual reality research to pen and touch computing, thanks to one of my PhD students, Joe Laviola, who convinced me that we should go from the ultimate in 3D back to flatland. But that turned out to be a very good idea. Anyhow, she found out that we knew about pen and touch interaction. And she said, I've just heard that Microsoft has released this coffee table-sized touch table. And if you're willing to have your group write the software that would let me display one of these unique assets that the library owns, the Garibaldi panorama, about which a lot more from Massimo, then I will buy 2 tables, one for me to use in the library and one for your group to keep, again, so you can debug the software and we get to use it. Then I said, deal. Didn't know what the Garibaldi panorama was, but it sounded like a really cool thing. So that got us launched on a sequence of projects, and we'll start with the first project, which was called Garibaldi, because all it was supposed to do is display that wonderful artifact. And Massimo is going to tell us about it.
Can I just do a little short autobiographical introduction? Because,
please.
Because the truth is that I missed the first 20 years of hypertext. And then I joined the Brown faculty in 1990, and I was initiated, thanks to George Landau and Bob's. In fact, I started to show up in their hypertext workshops, and Bobby Arellano was there, etc. Later on, I was kind of converted or perverted. I betrayed the Nelsonian spirit and became a sort of embraced the Tim Berners-Lee Vulgata, because both Alan and Elli allowed me to create this HTML and then XML version, web version of the Decameron web. So the Decameron web was born as a hypertext, really, but then immediately converted to something that was not exactly a hypertext-ish, I think Elli said it. Then another stint in Bob Coover's cave writing, with the digital Pinocchio project. But then finally I met Andy. And what brought us together was really the Garibaldi panorama. I think that perhaps showing that video, it would be the best introduction, so that you can have better than my words will introduce what the Garibaldi panorama is and what we did with it, thanks to Andy's crew. And perhaps we should. here's the Garibaldi panorama. So it's a moving panorama, 1860, made in England, 272 feet long, 4.5 feet tall. And it was shown as a sort of, pre-cinematic display with a live storytelling, music, etc. in a theater. But there should be a video here that, no? Oh, just click, okay. Right. Then.
The Garibaldi panorama is a very unique artifact. Very few of these survive from the 19th century. It's a very large piece of work. It's 273 feet long. It's painted on both sides in watercolor.
Peter Harrington, who's the curator of the John Hay, called me up and said, "You should come and see what we have here."
And it was a bit overwhelming.
Maybe just go back to
the with this. One idea behind digitizing it was to preserve it, but also to make it known to a much wider audience.
When the library scanned this, it was actually scanned.
Yeah, we should probably restart it. Here we go.
The Garibaldi panorama is a very unique artifact because very few of these survive from the 19th century. It's a very large piece of work. It's over 273 feet long. It's painted on both sides in watercolor.
Peter Harrington, who's the curator of the John Hay, called me up and said, "You should come and see what we have here."
And it was a bit overwhelming at the time. I thought, well, what can we do with this? One idea behind digitizing it was to preserve it, but also to make it known to a much wider audience.
When the library scanned this, it was actually scanned in about 40 or 50 individual blocks. And then the application stitches those together into a whole. So as you scroll through, it looks like one solid piece of artwork.
And of course, the website doesn't do justice to the scale of this thing. You see this on a 12-inch by 15-inch screen, and you see it passing through.
So then what was the next step? The next step was to put it on the Microsoft Surface so that you could touch that physical object, but in a virtual way.
You can actually look at the Surface at a basic level as almost being an oversized iPhone, except for it's more than that because it uses vision technology, so you don't actually have to touch the Surface in order to interact with it.
One can actually look at the Garibaldi panorama, move it around, touch the screen on certain panels, and see related material.
And that's really the meaning of research. And it's also the meaning of how you teach and how you learn. You take parts of existing documents, you recombine them, and you think about new meanings for them.
The possibility of zooming into these specific details and linking them to some of the documents, the documentation that we are collecting and gathering, it's extremely valuable.
This is a wonderful example of something that was never possible in the past, an item of great historical significance that almost never got used because it was essentially unusable because of its format, that now is opening up exciting possibilities.
You can do things differently, you can think differently, you can create differently if you have a different form factor.
It's become a fascinating interdisciplinary project which does not involve only the panorama as an art object, but a sort of a hybrid media.
So in many ways, the library becomes a place for publication, kind of public consumption of the materials. And I think that the Garibaldi project demonstrates how the library is able to do that.
Great. So I will add only a couple of things, basically explaining how this, both the design of this application. Sorry, I'm being boycotted here. YouTube. So both the design of the application and the work done with it happened basically in the same space, or clearly in Andy's laboratory, but also in the classroom. Because in a sense, we started to test the early versions of TAG, and providing the feedback of my students and I that made the tool, the functionalities available to us. And the point was to use the panorama itself as a great canvas, and in fact to collect those documents that would explain and explore in all its details, and being able to do that in an interactive and collaborative mode. And that was really the key to the whole operation. And I think the last thing I would add before letting Lucy actually show us some examples of that is that we were able, thanks to this application, we were able to take a virtual version of the panorama, an interactive virtual version of the panorama around the world. We took it to the British Library first, an exhibit, a famous exhibit about this innovation in visual applications in particular. But then we took it to Italy, various libraries and museums where, in fact, in Bologna, in the public library, there was an installation of tag on a machine and a big screen, and a lot of school children and the university and whoever was entering the lobby of the library could use and play with it, etc. It was a great hit, and of course a very difficult test for the hardware because we had some enthusiastic users who really put it. I had a video to show you, but I couldn't include it in the presentation. And even to Brazil at the International Council of Museum exhibit in the Italian pavilion. So we were able to share the Garibaldi panorama with the world. Thank you. Thank to Andy and his team.
Great. That's a wonderful story. Thank you, Massimo. Let's see. After this, we decided a system that would only show exactly one artifact was a little limited. So we developed LADs, large artwork displayed on the surface. You see the theme here. We wanted to tackle really big pieces because there wasn't any way of interacting with those in any other system. From LADs, in which we learned a lot of stuff, we then developed TAG, and Touch Art Gallery, again, has this museum, large artwork focus. And Lucy, who was the team lead on the project for a while and is now a PhD student at University at Boulder, is going to do a demo of some of the basic features, starting with the fundamental concept of the experience in TAG, which is being taken on a tour, a guided tour of some piece of art or some collection of related artworks, with the ability to stop the tour, interactively explore it via hyperlinks to ancillary materials.
Okay, am I on the mic? I am.
You are.
All right, hi. So yes, I'm going to show a little bit about TAG. TAG is organized by collections of artwork. So I'm going to load one now. That's our demo collection. And once you're in a collection, you can kind of scroll through, see things. You can also do things like sort by metadata, so things like artist, title, date. We have a timeline feature along the top as well. And then you can also view tours. And tours are a special sort of artifact within the TAG system. They kind of view like Ken Burns-style documentaries. So they're artifacts and annotations, but then they're complemented with visual effects and audio narration. But they're unique in that you can pause them and you can interact with what's on screen. So you can find out more information about the artifacts. So to kind of show this, I'm going to play a few tours. I'll start with playing a tour about the Garibaldi panorama, which we just heard about. So yeah, here we go.
The moving panorama depicting the life and times of Garibaldi is an example of the use of a popular subject for commercial entertainment. In 1860, the year in which the panorama was produced, Giuseppe Garibaldi was the man of the moment. His portraits, as well as his achievements at unifying Italy, graced the pages of the illustrated newspapers. Wars were particularly appealing subjects for panorama painters, and the events in Italy offered more than their fair share of combat, action, and drama. In this scene from the panorama, at the Battle of Milazzo, A major battle in the War for the Liberation of Eastern Sicily, the battalion of English volunteers commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Dunn, fighting alongside Garibaldi and his men, has gained an advanced post. They create a barricade at the top of the narrow strip of land between the mainland and the citadel and maintain fire against the Neapolitans. The manuscript for the panorama also mentions other names of volunteers in the English battalion.
Major Percy Wyndham, cousin of General Wyndham, greatly distinguished himself at Milazzo, especially in storming at the head of a few of his regiments a walled vineyard filled with Neapolitan riflemen. Peter Cunningham, a young sailor, asked Colonel Wyndham to pitch him over the vineyard wall behind which were the Neapolitan riflemen. The wall was 7 feet high, and he fell among the enemy like a bombshell, and with nearly the same effect, for they ran off right and left, startled at his sudden appearance.
It appears that the panorama's
Okay, so pretend I'm a museum visitor. I've been watching this on a large screen. I've heard about this soldier's act of bravery, and now I can basically stop this, just pause it, and then I can use just like your usual pinch zoom and other kind of touch gestures for navigating. So this is going to be like the same thing that I'm used to doing on my iPhone at this point. So I see this wall in the background. Maybe this is the wall they were talking about. I can also see in a drawer here on the left some additional information. So I can see the artist, the year it was painted, and the title. And then when I'm done exploring, I can just press play and the tour will resume.
Creator J.J. Story used a major newspaper, the Illustrated London News, as a direct source for painting this scene. Not only is the general composition of the smoke-filled tower framed by town buildings clearly taken from the article lithograph, but individual figures themselves have been copied. We can see this in the foreground figure sitting with his head in his hands to the right of 3 bodies, something which is in both images. There are also the soldiers taking the wounded man on a stretcher away to the left, the soldier in the window leaning out to shoot, and the officer in the center with his arm poised to shout orders. Despite these strong
I think Andy wanted me to zoom in on the text. Yes, it does still work. I'm like nervous to do things I haven't practiced in case it crashes, but it still seems rather stable. So yeah, I can zoom in, read the text, which would be great. This is the kind of thing I couldn't usually do at a museum, seeing artifacts. So having shown that one, I'll come back out and I'll show just briefly the viewer for the AIDS Memorial Quilt. So kind of like the Garibaldi panorama, this is a really large artwork. It would basically be impossible to display in a traditional museum setting. But in TAG, we can see it, and we can see just kind of the enormous scale as well as zoom in. And then we can see things like related materials, so we can bring those up and kind of like interact with them as well. I would explain this, but we do actually have a tour, so I'll hand it over to the professional narration for explaining it. So I'll just play a little bit of the AIDS quilt tour.
I'm Julie Rode, President and CEO of the Names Project Foundation, the caretaker of the AIDS Memorial Quilt. The AIDS Memorial Quilt is the world's most visible symbol of the AIDS epidemic, a gripping record of the lives of over 92,000 individuals whose names have been lovingly stitched into it by more than 100,000 friends and family members. Today, it takes over 1.3 million square feet to display the AIDS Memorial Quilt in its entirety. It weighs 54 tons and is the largest ongoing community art project in the world. This impressive scale, however, is matched only by the potent life stories and the intimate details contained in each panel. The quilt began in 1987 with a single panel created by quilt founder Cleve Jones for his dear friend Marvin Feldman. Each panel of the AIDS Memorial Quilt measures approximately 3 feet by 6 feet, a size that the quilt's founders chose specifically because it approximates the size of a human grave. The quilt is displayed in 12-foot by 12-foot sections called blocks, each one composed of 8 individual panels.
Okay, so I'll just pause this here. Basically, using TAG, we can get kind of the sheer scale of this artwork as well as zoom in and see the personal narratives. And it really is just kind of, the first time I saw this, I was amazed. This is part of what hooked me on this project. So yeah, this is using, I believe it's called Microsoft's Deep Zoom technology, so it'll sequentially load in higher resolution images as you get closer. But I'm going to take a step back, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the authoring environment for tags, so how the content actually gets into the system. So I've gone back out. I was just in the kiosk mode, which is what you would typically see in a museum. And then I'm typing in a password, and now I can get to the authoring mode. So this is what curators, professors, students would use to create their own collections and tag and tours. So you can import artwork, you can adjust metadata, and you can build tours. So I'm going to show that a little bit now. As you can see, the tour authoring interface is pretty similar to other kind of track-based video editing software. I have one track on screen here right now. And then if I want to, I can kind of scrub along and see how this would look at different points. And I can even kind of create animations with direct manipulation. So if I want an animation to start here, I can move the artwork to just where I want it to start. I can scrub over, move it somewhere else. And then instant playback, I can just play this back and see what will happen. So this is all designed for just like maximum simplicity. This is meant for non-technical users. So whereas we say for kind of the kiosk mode, people should just be able to walk up and use it. For the authoring mode, we say maybe it'll take you an hour of training. But it's not meant for like a technical audience. It's meant for anyone to be able to create content. And just to briefly show, I'll add another track. So this will load up all the artwork that we have here in our demo server. So I'll just pick another artwork. I'll import it into the tour. So as you can see, at this point, we have both artworks on screen. So kind of like the order of the tracks represents the Z order in the viewer. And again, I can create these keyframes so I can have two simultaneous animations happening. And then instant playback to see what that looks like. And then also within this editor, I can add annotations. So I could, for example, add a writing annotation. So maybe I'll add the name of this work of art. Okay, that looks like it. Select this. And now I can attach that to selected, make sure it shows at the same time. And then that annotation should be attached kind of as it's animating. So really simple, but also really powerful. Like I said, we've used this in courses for people who don't have a lot of experience doing this kind of thing. But then we've also used it to create 10-minute long tours with dozens of assets and annotations. I'll hand it back over to Andy now to talk about kind of the evolution of this project.
She'll be back in a moment.
I will be back in a moment, though.
So Massimo just reminded me that the students in his course use this tool for creating their own expositions of particular pieces of the Garibaldi panorama. So we built this. Massimo was our client, as it were. There were others on the Brown faculty who used it for their courses. Pardon?
Guinea pig.
Guinea pig, right. Long-suffering guinea pig. Of course, we debugged on him, and to a lesser extent on his students. And then one day, I got a call from my Microsoft sponsor saying, how would you like to do a rush project for 2 weeks to see if maybe the Nobel Foundation would like to use your tag software in a traveling exhibition that they're going to do all around the world. But in that 2 weeks, you have to show us a proof of concept demo. So I thought about it, and I said, that's crazy. And then I thought about it some more and say, crazy is what we do. So
why do we need 2 weeks?
So I went to my team, and we had a democratic vote. Right, Lucy? Oh, absolutely. Okay. And we said, are we going to kill ourselves to try to win this? Because that would be a pretty neat thing to say the Nobel Foundation is our client. So we killed ourselves for 2 weeks. a bunch of people, Carlene Negadula, her dad is in the audience, Miranda Chow, Tiffany Citra, Lucy, Trent Green. Everybody went flat out despite their courses, what are courses after all. And then there was a bake-off between us and a system called ChronoZoom, which had been funded at about an order of magnitude more and had been running for much longer and so on, and we won. And that was the good news and the bad news, because then we worked on an extremely tight no give on this deadline, because the exhibition opens in Singapore, October or something or other. Lucy left us for greener pastures. Trent Green took over, and Trent wound up building a special version of TAG because they couldn't deal with the internet. It had to be absolutely bulletproof, no ability to reboot or anything like that. So it's purely on the server, and we have one laptop that still runs it under Win 8, and Lucy is now going to demo it.
I'm going to demo it in 1 minute. Okay, so this is obviously the splash screen. Did you mention the size of the screen that this would be displayed on?
Big.
Ginormous. Yeah, I think 81 inches. So imagine large
Touch
screen.
screen.
Touch screen. And so what they really wanted was a display that focused on Alfred Nobel's will. So this is the will in which he lays out the intention to create the Nobel Prize. It's a 4-page document, and what they wanted was basically this interactive experience, where as you scroll down, you see related information on the side. So I'll show just a couple of pages.
And
we
the
also
translation
have,
on the left.
English translation on the left. So it's kind of like a treasure hunt for fun little information. Yeah, so maybe I'll just go back. Basically, when you start to see these words that are kind of outlined in red, those are the links. So for example, I could try to learn more about Robert Nobel, who's Alfred Nobel's brother. I can tap on that, and then I see basically his bio. I can see what collections he's part of, so I can go kind of see the whole family. I can also click on tours as well that they're in. Actually, should I just play a tour briefly?
30 seconds.
Okay.
Karen has graciously granted us
I don't
a
think
reprieve.
I have.
Though Alfred Nobel was a bachelor with no children of his own, who lived most of his adult life far from his relatives, his family still played an important role in the development of his ideals and career. Some of his nephews and nieces, children of 2 of his 3 industrialist brothers, were remembered in his will. Alfred Nobel's interest in technology certainly came in large part from his father, Emmanuel Nobel.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop.
Okay. When it says interact with image, you can see more, so yeah.
All the Ken Burns vocabulary of slow pan zooms, plus our overlays and highlighting, and our hypermedia links, which sometimes went 2 levels deep, but not deeper than that. We didn't want people having a directed graph to deal with. These were for walk-up experiences. Then there's lots of additional information on the bottom. Let's look at the slides. I've lost my grip on the advance. Do we have the little gadget? Are we in the right place for the slides? Okay. This was the other part of the exhibit on a different screen, color-coded, keyworded so that you could do retrieval. Press on any one of those and you could get a little biography. You could find out, for example, how many females won Nobel Prizes, how many females won 2 Nobel Prizes. You know the answer. And this was a cool interactive experience too. So we had a lot of fun with it. Trent Green got to travel as a sophomore, all expenses paid to Singapore and hang out with the Nobel Foundation crew and make sure that everything worked flawlessly. It did. It was up for 6 months, traveled to Dubai. It's went from India to some other place. It's still going. The Mass Historical Society built a 6-month-long exhibition on Jefferson and his papers. I got to see a draft of the Declaration of Independence, which they had there. Fabulous. So they completely on their own authored their own tours and so on. So it has been used in courses at Brown and in a few museum-like situations. And that's, I think, all we have time for. Thank you very much, Lucy. All right, Norm, next. Okay. So now we come to present time as the wrap-up. And Bob Zeleznik and Tyler Schicke are going to do a joint demo of our latest and greatest system. Warning, the system is 4 months old. It is pre-alpha, way before pre-alpha. We've never shown it publicly. This is its maiden voyage, its maiden flight. It may crash and burn, and you'll all be sympathetic because you've all been there. And you'll notice lots of borrowed ideas. We always try to build on what we and others have done and add a little invention on top of that. But the familiar themes from 50 years of hypertext research here and elsewhere will be immediately apparent. Do you need lights, guys, or? Yeah, let's look at the slides first. Can we still do that, or are we in the demo?
No, they're right there.
Okay, they're on the right-hand side. Bob, here, you can do them. Or are you needed for that? Okay, there we go.
Yeah, just leave it on that. Okay, ready? It's truly inspirational to have been taken on this journey today through Brown's rich legacy of hypertext. It's also a bit humbling. Our project is only 3 to 4 months old, and we're very much playing catch up with a lot of the work that's been done as far back as the 60s. So,
is he on? Yeah, okay. A little closer to your mouth. Yeah.
Okay. So the work you're going to see today is, again, very much like the kinds of projects you've seen in the past. One of the big differences is that this is using a web-based app, and everything is done with synchronous collaboration in mind. So that presents some new opportunities and some new challenges. Our goal is really to make it easy for people to collect, organize, share, annotate any type of media. Currently, we don't have as rich a development of text itself, which is why it's more of a hypermedia system at this time. But again, we aspire to be able to recapture a lot of the things that you've done in the past. With that, I think we just want to switch over to...
Here, you still got one slide left.
Yeah, all right, so I think we can get to this during the demo.
Okay, fine.
So what you're seeing here is a collection of documents related to this symposium that we're at now. This is something that Rosemary Simpson and Andy built as sort of their personalized view of the kind of information that's relevant to Andy's talk and beyond. So one of the things that a free-form layout like this provides is the ability to sort of see things out of the corner of your eye. You can pan around, as you see when you go off screen here, it's a kind of a spherical space so that you try to avoid getting lost, which encourages you to, again, explore. So as we're exploring around this space, you might see something that's interest. Here's a collection with Doug Engelbart as the focus. If we enter that collection, we see a variety of different document types. So one of these, as you're browsing around, you might notice it has a hyperlink, and you notice that in this case by the highlighting that happens. If we click on that, bug number 1. I forgot to close something in the past. Try that again. So when you see something, you click on the hyperlink, it smoothly scrolls to the target. In this case, it's a paragraph within a PDF. We can open that PDF, and as we look through it, we see that there's other targets. So each of these targets is an overlay document. So to us, an anchor in a document is another document. In this case, this was the target of that first hyperlink, but we see that there's another one. And if I click on that, this took me to a different PDF. This one, Vannevar Bush is seminal paper. And again, we notice that there's another hyperlink in here, and we follow that again. And so we followed a little trail, sort of an obvious media trail. If we had just uncovered this document, though, these links are bidirectional, so we would be able to, can you hold this a second? So with this link, we can follow it backward to the previous papers. So having followed this trail back to the beginning now, we see this PDF, but what was interesting about this PDF in part was the collection that it was in. So now we're just seeing the PDF by itself, but we can, for any document, see the contexts that are available. So in this case, we only see that there's one context. If we climb up that context, we will recover that space that we were in before. And again, this document, which is this collection, did I just close that? Sorry, just closed it. If we follow that again, we can find that it was in a collection of people, which, again, we could follow up. So each of these spaces is linked together, both in terms of this hierarchy and through these explicit document-to-document links. So I'm going to, sorry? Yeah, so I'm going to go back up to the top level again. So in this top-level workspace, each of these documents that we see in here can exist in multiple places at the same time. So this isn't sort of a purely hierarchical system. Anything in here we can create an alias for, but I need an extra hand to do that. So for example, we can have a document in here. Oops. Actually, that would make a copy of that whole collection, but I want to make a copy just of one document in here. So now this, again, exists in two places, both in this nested collection and outside. And this is part of the reason why when you were looking at it before, when you open up a document, you want to see the collections that it's in. So we see that this now exists in multiple different places. So let's see. What are things I want to do? So another feature of the system is that this workspace may look a little bit like Andy's desk, if you're familiar with that. It's kind of cluttered. Maybe it makes sense to him. He has a good spatial memory. But other people might want to see things with a decluttered and a more hierarchical view. So any of them you could switch, for example, in this case, to a tree view. So now I'm seeing that same information. So this is the same information we saw before. And as you're looking at this stuff, you might see something again that was interesting. So we can click on one of them and would open up that document in its own space. So if we can go back out to the, I'm just going to leave it like that. If we go back to the Engelbart collection, another thing that's somewhat interesting in here is that we do have different media types. So in this case, we have a video, which we can play in line. I don't know if we get audio, it doesn't really matter. But we also have clippings on the side, and each of these clippings index into a different part of the video. So in this case, we index into a part of the video where we have an ink annotation that we've made along with a text note. So if we play on a little bit farther, that annotation goes away. They only last a few seconds. But if we wanted to create another bookmark in this video, it's as simple as just taking a snapshot of it. And so now we have a new bookmark for that video at this new time code. This snapshot is an image document at this point, but we can turn it into a button, which essentially means that this entire document becomes an anchor. So now if we click on it, it would focus on that frame of the video, and we can switch between the different frames. So this is an example of one of several different types of annotations or links that we can make between documents. So another type of thing that you might want to do if you had a collection like this that you felt might be a little bit cluttered, you might want to clean it up. So I need this again, sorry. So here I can make a selection around a couple of documents and with a keystroke collapse them into a summary. So this might be images of Engelbart. And so now we've taken those documents out of this workspace, but they're still accessible. And again, if I turn this into a button, I can click on that and open up the workspace with those two documents that I had just summarized. So this would be a way to clean it up. You can also open up those documents within the same workspace we were just in if you wanted to sort of temporarily align them. Another way you could do something like that might be if you had a set of documents, you might want to collapse them into something like a bullet. So we can say interesting, get my spelling there, PDF. So now if we select this, I can collapse that into, oops, off the screen, sorry. Do that same thing again. And collapse this into a bullet, which now lets me take that media and, is that animating on this? It's kind of jumping. So it's sort of a little jumpy here. Oh, that's part of the problem. So the idea, again, would be that you can collect a bunch of things into sort of on-the-fly bullets, which, again, would be useful for decluttering an environment if that was your goal. I think, yeah, so I want to transition now. Tyler, can you get your laptop? So another part of the system is being able to take any of these spaces and operate on them collaboratively. So if we go to a shared space that we've set up, then in a moment we should be able to see Tyler's icon. So that means that he exists in this space as well. If he goes and creates a text note or something like that, it'll show up on my side. Are you able to? No, so there, he's typing the hello part, and I'm in the meantime doing something entirely different. So each of these documents we have has its own unique URL. So if I had a collection of documents such as this Engelbart one on the left, I could take its URL and email it to Andy, and he could open it up in his browser, and we could be synchronously collaborating at the same time. He could work on it offline, and I would see all of his updates later. Are we running out of time?
I think so. I think we've shown most features that work today. I'll just say a couple of things to amplify what you've seen. Everything in the system is a document. Why don't we do key value pane? Oh, and you really should show, sorry. Can we have 2 more minutes? Yeah. Let's show North Star stuff.
Okay.
So everything is a document. Documents have metadata. Key value pairs, you can augment what is wired in with your own key value pairs. A value can be composite, so that's pretty general. Even links are documents, therefore have their own metadata, therefore are searchable with the search facility. So we sort of have the old FRES NLS capabilities of being able to find only certain links or certain pieces of information based on Boolean and regex retrieval requests. And one of my former PhD students in the back, Emmanuel Zgragan, did a wonderful PhD on a system called North Star now, which is a database visualization program. He worked with Steve Drucker some years ago at Microsoft Research. And the idea behind his software is to take structured and unstructured data and have a visual programming interface for being able to see it. Bob is very interested in baseball statistics and other forms of table manipulation, and that should be part of any IDE for knowledge workers, because many of us do have tabular data. So he'll show a little bit of Emmanuel's PhD work imported into Dash.
So yeah, very briefly, what I did is I just searched on the web for something that had a table. I selected the table, pasted it into the system where each of the rows of that table comes in as a document. So this first document has each of these columns as one of its metadata fields.
Oh, I'll let you close.
From that, I asked the system to convert this into a North Star database, which just means that it passes it off to a different server that we have that processes this kind of table in a way that I can drag off these headers. So when I dragged off the H header, what it did is it gave me a histogram showing me of the documents that I brought in, who was of a given age, I took another histogram off of how many games those people played, and then using the same kind of linking mechanism that we would use to link one document to another if we were just doing regular hypertext, I can link one of these visualizations to the other. And what that does is that if I choose something in one histogram, it filters the other based on that data. So here I've chosen all the players that are 22 or 23 years old or something like that, and it shows how many games they played. So this is a quick way to go from seeing something that's of interest on the web that you'd like to explore more, unlike pasting it into something like Excel, where you get to sort of manipulate the data a little bit. This is really designed to make it feel lightweight and easy to go and explore with sort of a touch-based or a very lightweight interface for exploring the data and different relationships that are available. I'm not going to go into any more detail. North Star has much more power than what I'm showing here, but I think that's kind of the goal, to say that we'd like to lower those barriers from being able to grab data from any source, put it into an environment where there really aren't any ceilings, that you can mix that data with other types of applications and blend them together to whatever task is at hand.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Part of this business of grab stuff that's interesting to you and manipulate it is that, of course, we can do grabs from web pages, and we get the underlying HTML. So the document is live, the URLs are live, and so you can play hypertext games with your little clipping that you got from your web. Okay, so we're out of time, and I'm going to turn the program back over to your ringmeister, and we're close to closing.
Folks. So I want to take a little stretch break before the second half of the... in closing, wanted to thank a bunch of people. Lisa Maniskovsky, who organized all of the logistics here, Jesse Polimas, who helped with that, Brown Media Technology Services, and Northeast Showtime Productions, who did this, the library staff, the Brown CS technical staff, Andy, and it was remarkable watching all this stuff, just seeing how far things have come from 50 years ago, but also how much is left to do. And it also was great to see that two things, that the technology has always been a very much Brown thing, where it hasn't just been technology for technology's sake, but you can see all of the different disciplines, social science and humanities, are integrated into the technologies that are built and also used in education. And also, if you notice that from the beginning, there have been women in the leadership positions of all of these technology projects. So that's actually another virtue of Brown's hypertext legacy. So with that, there will be a reception in the CIT. Andy would like to get a picture of everybody outside, so he's in charge of that goat rodeo. And thank you all for coming.
So, light refreshments, beer and wine, for an hour or so on the third floor of the CIT. I'm hoping that the elevators are unlocked, but could we please mass on the steps of the CIT to have our picture taken? Thank you all so much for participating and for 50 years of dedicated hard work.